Today I want to talk about one very crucial supply that I use every single time I paint with watercolor, and a lot of you have actually asked me to do a video about this supply, so that is what we're doing today. I find it really interesting, at least from what I've seen. I haven't really noticed a lot of people talking about this particular supply, and I think it's because it's not really one of the showy supplies of watercolor. Watercolor paper and watercolor paints and watercolor just palettes, those are all really cool and just look really pretty on camera. But this particular supply is just as important as those, but yet it's kind of a dull looking supply. The supply that I'm talking about is a stretching board. I've heard it called a lot of other things, but basically it's a wood board that is meant to stretch your watercolor paper on. And stretching your watercolor paper is very, very crucial when you are painting with watercolor. I don't know of any watercolor artist who doesn't stretch their watercolor paper. They're either going to use a wood board, such as the one that I just showed you, or they're going to be using a watercolor block, which are pre-stretched, basically pack of paper all together. So in my opinion, this is a very crucial supply to have in your repertoire, as they say, of supplies. But why is this supply so important? Well, actually, there are 3 reasons why I really like this particular supply, and those include:
SOUNDSTRIPE.
Reason number 1, it prevents warping. So the very first thing is that when you are stretching your watercolor paper onto a board, especially one that is a very heavy wood board, it's going to prevent your paper from buckling or warping, especially when you're using more wet on wet techniques. And it's basically because your paper is flattened against a smooth surface, and it's especially going to prevent those corners from basically pulling up when you're painting on it. The second reason why I love to use a wooden board basically to work on is because it's easy to tilt and move the board as I'm painting, especially when doing more intricate, larger sections of, I would say, more wet on dry sections. I personally like watercolor washes that are super smooth. So by being able to have my watercolor painting on a board and kind of move it around and tilt it, I can actually use gravity to help work with me and pull my paint into a certain direction. So basically, I'm not having to work as hard to get my paint to flow in one direction and create those nice smooth gradients or even just flat washes. And finally, the third reason why I really like to use a board when I am painting on watercolor paper is because it allows my paper to take a lot more abuse, especially when I'm using more student grade paper. I have done several illustrations on the Watercolor B paper, which is 100% cotton paper, and if you haven't watched my series on watercolor paper, make sure you go check that out. Basically, I compare different types of paper ranging from artist grade to student grade papers, and as most of you who have watched that series know, that a student grade paper that I really like is Watercolor B paper, but this paper still does not do really well with wet on wet. However, that being said, I have done very many illustrations, I would say, with that particular paper but stretched my paper the traditional way onto a wood board. And by using a cheaper paper, but stretching it with staples and basically prepping that paper on both sides wet and doing the whole procedure of stretching it the traditional way, I'm actually able to force that paper to deal with a lot more water abuse, and it still stays nice and taut against that wood board. And basically what is happening is kind of think of your paper as being the top of a drum, and the staples are basically pulling it as tight as it possibly can on your wood board. So what happens when you add water to your paper actually is going to expand out, and that is when you need to put your staples down on your paper. You're basically wetting your paper until it's nice and pliable. You're gonna wet both sides, and then you're gonna staple all the way around, and then you're gonna allow that to completely dry. And what's gonna happen is while it's wet, it's gonna expand out as far as it possibly can, but then when it dries, it's gonna shrink back. But because it had those staples holding it basically in place, it makes it super tight and taut against that board. And that is how you're able to paint more wet on wet and really push your paper with more water abuse without it buckling and warping as much. So using a wooden board is really, really great. Now, what type of wood board do I use? This particular wood board is something that I picked up at Home Depot, and I basically picked it up for $22, but it was a huge sheet. It was huge. It was, I had to have my husband help me take it to the back area, but basically it was a huge sheet that's $22, and it is birch wood. So you can see right there. It's a birch wood sheet, and it's really thick, a thick wood. Basically, the reason why I recommend birch wood is because while I was there and I was talking to basically the guy over the lumber section, I told him what I was wanting to do. I wanted to stretch my watercolor paper on a board that could take water abuse, and he recommended birch wood because birch wood actually does really, really good against water. And he told me that like a lot of log cabins up in the mountains actually use birch wood to keep water out. So that's what I used based on his recommendation. I started doing this about 3 years ago. And ever since then, I have absolutely fallen in love with my birch wood board. And basically I had him cut it down to, I think it's 19 inches by 19. I had it cut down into a square. So this is what it typically looks like when you first get it. But then I painted it white on top with chalk paint, and I did that for 2 reasons. The first reason was for filming. I personally like filming on a white surface. It's just easier to get my white balance correct on my camera. But then the second reason is I'm actually using that chalk paint as just an extra added layer of protection on that wood to kind of seal it and keep the water out. So that is kind of my little 2 cents on my birchwood board and why I use it. So hopefully you enjoyed this. It's just a little talky video today of this particular supply that I find very, very important. If you want me to go more in depth of how I created this, please make sure to leave a comment down below and also a like to this video so I know you want me to maybe go more into depth into basically how I went about making my birchwood boards. So anyway, that is it for today, and happy painting, y'all, and I'll see you next time.